Our next speaker, he'll be speaking about protecting the plant in the connecting age. He is the principal OT security architect for Tenable's network security, based in the UK. He articulates Tenable's industrial security technical strategy across Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and advises on the design of security architects for them. Let's welcome Mr. Dominic Storey.
Okay, so I want to remind you something about cyber attacks. Cyber attacks don't just happen because you're attacked by somebody. They happen because you have a vulnerability. You have a vulnerability in your system, and that is what is exploited. So we need to remember, A, that your plant or whatever it is, your grid distribution system or whatever your industrial system is, will be exploited. And of course, it happens against companies which are technology dependent. And of course, who isn't nowadays technologically dependent on things? Lastly, your cyber attacks use malicious code, and everyone thinks about just malicious code. They're not thinking of the fact that it's against other programs or against logic or just data within your environment. So just by changing some logic within your environment, we don't have to damage anything. Changing data in your environment doesn't damage anything, but can fundamentally risk your business. And so, and the disruptive consequences that can happen in a cyber attack against an industrial system can be way, way larger than will happen in an IT system. And we'll explore this in a moment. So many of you may be CISOs, may manage the security in your environments, and you'll know that there's a formal way which we do this in the corporate environment. We look to see where we're exposed. We look to see what we should focus on first, do the triage, do the work against what we need to, and to be sure that we can then deal with those vulnerabilities. And then we measure how well we reduce things over time. And of course, lastly, we want to compare ourselves against our peer companies. And the very simple reason we do this is, I use the analogy of being attacked by a tiger. If a tiger decides to chase you, then you don't have to run faster than the tiger, you just have to run faster than your companion. So we want to make sure we're not the lowest common denominator in an environment. So typically I talk to many organizations and many people who have been given responsibility for OT security. They may come from the IT world, but they're being told by their boards, you must manage your OT risk. They're being handed what I call the risk bomb. Here you go, you have to manage the plant now. And they may have no experience in dealing with the OT department. And what they have to do is they have to understand what the consequence of something attacking an OT system is. Now they understand it well for IT, we all do. We know that if we have a loss of service, we'll do a restore, we'll bring those systems back online, and maybe we'll lose an hour or two, or maybe a little longer, and we'll get some disgruntled customers, some unhappy customers. But nobody died. That's not the case in OT, where an attack against the plant could result in some deaths, many deaths, or could result in an environmental local catastrophe. So we have to understand that the consequences are very different. So what's our IT person to do? They need to evaluate and do their due diligence on the risk. Do they accept it? Or do they evaluate all the systems, IT and OT, and then decide to act upon those risks? They may not be able to patch things because patching requires downtime, and you may not have downtime if your business is running an aluminium smelting plant, which only goes down every 3 years. Or you may decide to hand that risk back once you've analyzed it, and if the OT people say, we simply will not allow you to touch our plant, why should you accept that risk yourself? Hand that back to those people. So why is industrial risk different? Industrial risk is different from normal corporate risk because in a corporate process, we often have multiple suppliers. I mean, we choose multiple suppliers for redundancy and so that we're not beaten down on price. And we have multiple processes within the business which can often take over the parts of other processes. And we have manual processes to back up those automated processes. So there's lots of redundancy in the way most corporate processes are built. And if you like, think of them as virtual. They're easy to reconfigure. They have short lifetimes, within 1 to 2 or 3 years typically, before we restructure our processes. And they're unique across different companies. One company may not do their business the same way as another, okay? And they have little environmental impact themselves as a corporate business process. However, that's not the same for OT. If you run a smelting plant, that smelting plant is going to be exactly the same whether it's in Saudi Arabia, whether it's in Oman, or whether it's in Kuala Lumpur. If you're running a fluid catalytic cracking plant for petroleum, it's going to be the same here as it is in Texas. And that means that vulnerabilities in those systems will be understood by attackers, nation-state attackers, and they can apply exactly the same kind of principles across your plant, their plant, and many organizations. So it's physical, it's hard to change. After all, you put a system in, it's cost you $1 billion to put in a cracking plant. You know you can't just easily change that because you found a vulnerability. The equipment has long life, and there are known processes, and they have deep physical consequences should something fail and catastrophically release something into the environment. So what's at stake? Let's look at the fundamental attacks people do on plants. And it really boils down to 4 things: unauthorized start, unauthorized stop, unauthorized change, and a compromise of the core system itself. So if I stop a process like a power plant, or I interrupt an aluminium smelting plant, or I interrupt the grid distribution, then typically we'll have power blackouts, automotive assembly line halts, and so on. Now, for Volkswagen, that's $22,000 a minute for every minute the plant is down. Okay, so it can be very expensive. Okay, but nobody normally dies when we have a power interruption or a failure in this way. Not the case when you start something up that shouldn't be running. Because what happens if somebody is cleaning, doing maintenance on a turbine, and you start that turbine? That person's going to be killed, okay? Or you open sluice gates in a water processing plant and flood your river systems with untreated sewage, as happened in Australia in 2000. When we look at change, somebody changes a set point in a system. That change may propagate through because it's not a stop and a start, but it's just an alteration. It may not even be noticed for some time. For example, if a pressure release valve, a set point is set 10, 20 pascals higher than it should be, or megapascals higher, that vessel could fail, but it will only fail in certain conditions. So that is the issue of this kind of attack. And lastly, we all know this one, the Stuxnet style approach. Somebody infecting a system with a deliberate virus. That's what you read in the newspaper, and this is what the board reads about. This is why they come down and say you have to do something. But I say it's not this last one which is the issue, it's the first 3. We always have to make sure we're covering off 2. When we look at those 4 attacks, and then we look at something like ransomware, which is on the up in this space, these are built upon the same 4 attacks they use. They will interrupt the processes you have in your plant, but they will hold you to ransom and not allow you to have control of your plant until you pay them money. But because the consequence of loss is so great, nearly everyone pays ransomware. And this is why it's seen as a great new market for ransomware, because there's a high cost of downtime, high cost of consequence, and an immediacy which just isn't quite there in the corporate world. A good example of this ransomware attack was on Norsk Hydro, global aluminium producer, 35,000 employees in 40 countries. They got hit by Lokagoga in March, and that resulted in the halt of some of their plants, and they pretty much had to start using pen and paper to order new materials and so on. They couldn't use their computers. It cost them 40 million in the first week. However, not all of these incidents are caused by active, attack actors. They may be caused by other means, and I want to talk about that. A good example is the cautionary scanning tail of the Large Hadron Collider. You may have heard about this. This is a large machine of 26 kilometers in radius. Those 26 kilometers of tubing contain high vacuum systems, superconducting magnets, and a very low temperature liquid helium cooled cryostats. There are 10,000 of them in the ring, going all the way around through 2 countries. There are 10,000 PLCs or controllers controlling these cryostats and steering the beams in this environment. And before the LHC went live, the IT department decided to scan it. So they issued a deep scan of the entire network, and 1/3 of those 10,000 controllers stopped responding. They had to go round on bicycles within the tunnels and restart 3,000 controllers. Another one is this, and it's a Polish glass maker. Here you can see molten glass dropping down through, and this is how you make jam jars. Okay, so glass comes down, pours into this environment, and then is processed. And this processing happens every 2 seconds, twice a second. Molten pours down into this environment and then automatically creates jam jars. Very finely tuned in timing, 500 milliseconds apart. And if you get the timing wrong, then you're going to miss, the molten will miss. And the IT department of this Polish company scanned their network and introduced a 10 millisecond latency into the switches, causing it to miss by 4 millimeters. And that caused molten glass to spray everywhere over the plant. They had to shut it down, and they had 10 minutes to fix it, because you've got several tons of molten glass in pipelines above you. And if that solidifies, it's game over for the plant. These are some of the risks we see in this kind of business. And why do we have so much trouble with automation kit? And that's simply because this kind of kit may be very old. In a power distribution network, you may have kit which is 15 to 30 years old. National Rail in the UK, they have, or Railtrack, they have 30-year mandatory lifetimes on all of their process control stuff. So it may be running really old operating systems like Windows or PDP-11s, RT11, things like this. And these resources are quite constrained. So there may be kilobytes of RAM, not megabytes or gigabytes at all. And the stacks of these systems may well be just in firmware. And so you just can't upgrade them should something go wrong with them. And when you go and scan them, they may just turn belly up and die. And that could be a catastrophic failure that causes somebody to die. So how do we acquire vulnerability information from an environment where I can't easily scan it? Well, the trick for effective discovery of your plant is passive monitoring. If you can monitor and listen to the traffic and then from that figure out what the machinery is, you're in a much better position. However, I can tell you this, master-slave programs and logic controllers don't chat very much. In other words, all that happens is you say, tell me the temperature, and it says 45 degrees. That's it. Doesn't give you any more information than that. So you do need to introduce some intelligent inquiry as well. Tell me what kind of controller you are. Ah, I am a Schneider Electric BMX P34. Great. And by mixing these two together, we can have a smart discovery system that allows us to get the most out of our plant at the minimum risk of discovery. Get this? I have a system now called adaptive sensing. That adaptive sensing system can now feed an asset discovery database. And once I have that database, I can then do vulnerability assessment because I know what the machines are, the software versions, and so on. So strategies for discovery require us to place sensors on the network. And the typical places you put them would be on port mirrors on your switches. Not all places on these environments have port mirrors because maybe the switches aren't managed. In this case, we have to use network taps to get that information off, to copy the information off, which can be a challenge in itself because they may have to actually then go and have some downtime to insert the tap. So these things are swings and roundabouts. There's a compromise we have to look at in getting this information out. And remember, not all scanning is bad if done well. If you do it badly, you're going to end up losing things. If you do it well, such as backplane enumeration or Nessus-style scanning of computers higher up in the stack, then we can do that safely. So passive monitoring has a great advantage. If you have a plant and you only have 1 week's downtime a year, doing a discovery when the plant goes down for maintenance is a challenge, because it might take you 4 days to figure out what you have to do. And then you've got almost no time to fix it. Much better if you could discover information continually all year round and then build your list, your work list, and then work on that as soon as the plant is taken into maintenance mode. That's the advantage of real-time vulnerability assessment. So where do I place these monitors? Well, let's look at an industrial network to see what they look like. Basically, every network is kind of looked a bit like this. I have devices. I have sensors and actuators. A sensor would be a temperature sensor, a pressure sensor, a gas flow sensor, or it could be a rotation sensor, anything like that. And an actuator could be a gas valve, could be a high voltage switch, could be relays, anything like this. And they're typically controlled by programmable logic controllers and remote terminal units. Think of these as the control system and the telemetry system. And they in turn feed operator consoles and engineering consoles. These are what we use to turn on a plant, turn off a plant, put a plant into maintenance mode, up the plant's efficiency, and so on. They, in turn, are supported by historians, by configuration servers, which then gather and store data over long term for trending and analysis. And of course, every plant has ordinary IT equipment. You've still got to do email if you're a plant manager, and you've still got to order equipment. So there's a mix of technologies within every large plant. And this is still part of the plant network, and it's separate from corporate. Indeed, this architecture is so common, we have a name for it. It's the Perdue Model. And I can say if a device is sitting at Perdue level L2, then it typically means it's a site supervisory system. It's turning on and off something. If it's a L0, then it's going to be a sensor or a valve or something like that, a field instrument, if you like. So we place technologies such as passive discovery at the switch level on the IP networks. And we may place multiple of these where we need them to be. And we may place scanners higher up in the architecture where there's more resilience and less criticality to scan. And we may place those same scanners in the corporate environment. And indeed, there's a huge advantage of having the same architecture for corporate and plant, because there's less you have to relearn, and you have a common means of understanding your vulnerability cyber risk. So some thoughts about deployment. I've yet to see one plant looking exactly the same as another, because every major system I have is still uniquely tuned for that plant. Even though you may have very similar core processes, if you're talking about gas or electricity or whatever. But the comparison between them, they're all very different. So I found that personally, that if you try and sell one system that covers all of these things, my experience with my customers is that fails, and they get very unhappy of a system that doesn't really fit their needs. It's better to think about this as being, if you like, I'll just go back a slide, rather than selling the suit, sell the tailor. In other words, provide a service that makes sure the system works in your environment. So I think of myself as a tailor rather than as a person who sells suits. And indeed, our approach to this should be around sittings, if you like. Overview the solution, agree the list of devices that you have, and calibrate the system to work with your devices so you actually know it's going to do a good job in your environment. And then deploy a pilot to prove this case. When we deploy a pilot like this, we know we won't pick up everything, because the next part is a bit more of a trim and a tuck to make sure that the solution understands your unique things in your own environment to work correctly. We do that, and then we add and tune and move sensors around until we get optimum coverage. This is the experimentation that always has to be done in a plant in this way. The final fitting then comes down to when you're happy, then we talk about a deployment across your network. And indeed, if you can do that in both corporate and in the cloud and in the plant, you have something very, very powerful for you, a unified risk management architecture across all assets in your business. Indeed, this is exactly the model we at Tenable follow, and our systems are designed around the same components I've talked about. Nessus Network Monitors are our passive discovery systems, and then Nessus Scanners are our active scanning systems. And our Tenable SC is a consolidation point that brings all of this information together to give you your unified cyber risk management. So, in summary, and I think I'm doing okay on time, is we look for vendors, or I suggest you look for vendors who have a good track record in cyber risk management. We've been doing this for 20 years. We know how to do it, we have the technology to do it, and it's been deployed in thousands and thousands of organizations across the world. Look for good consolidation across plant, cloud, and corporate, because that gives you the advantage of the use. And lastly, consider that these systems aren't always easy to deploy. Look for somebody who's going to take and be pragmatic about the deployment requirements and the risks in doing so, and gives you the fastest path to success in outcome-driven multi-phase deployment. And with that, I will say thank you very much and take any questions that you have.
Thank you for this presentation. I have one question.
Sure.
Is it possible to integrate the Tenable Security Center, whether it's the passive or the active scanners? Can I integrate them with my SIM solution, and what kind of information is going to be available for both the SOC analyst and the vulnerability analyst at the same time?
Yes, so the question, as I understand it, is can I take the output from these systems, integrate it into your other SIMs and your other environments? You may have Splunk, or you may have RSA or some other console. The answer is yes. We have well-defined APIs and integrations into things like ServiceNow and so on. So not only can I put the data into another system, I can have the workflow going into your ticketing system so that you can integrate that together. Yes.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. I have a question regarding the ICS and the enterprise network.
Yes.
In this Perdue model, you have shown the scanning from the ICS to the corporate level. What is the best practices for the SOC establishment? It should be the integrated SOC, as you shown here in this environment. If it is the separate SOC for ICS and the enterprise, how it will work?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do not mandate or require you to have the same SOC or the same system. We can feed the same environments, and indeed our security center allows you to have separate repositories, one for industrial and one for corporate, and then have role-based management so you have different people managing them. That's really important for many organizations. Secondly, you can have more than one console and you can feed different systems, and some companies have separated them out, and if that's fine. We support that. If you integrate them, we support that too. So we don't mind either way. That make sense? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Give it time. Let's give a big round of applause. Thank you.